And I'll start off this afternoon with a true story from the archives of MMS. We had a session in MMS a few years ago. It was the Deployment Jeopardy session. And at this session, we went to the conference organizers and we asked them, hey, this is a pretty fun session. It's the last session slot of the entire conference. Can we get a bar in our room? And it turns out they said yes. And we had an open bar in the room during our session. I tried that again for this session. They did not say yes this time, so my apologies in advance, but when we get you out of here, my understanding is there are plenty of bars in the city. I don't know, I'm told that, but hopefully you should be okay if you can hold out for just 75 minutes. So, welcome to App Compat for Windows 8. My name is Chris Jackson. I'm also called the App Compat guy, and I've been working in the App Compat space since about 2006. I've visited and worked directly with more than 300 different customers around the world. Pretty good at finding my way around airports as a result, much to my dismay. But hopefully I have some good information to share with you today. My App Compat talks, just to kind of set the stage a little bit, kind of go into two different flavors. There's the one that I usually call very directly App Compat for Nerds, which tends to dive into assembly language quite a bit. And then there's another one which goes into the higher order, how do I plan a really effective project? That's what we're doing today. So if that's not what you think this is, then you may be disappointed. But if what you are thinking is, how am I going to get through this as fast as possible, as efficiently as possible, and become more agile, that's what I hope to deliver on that. So to kind of get a sense of where you are today and what made you show up and kind of hang out at this time of day instead of going and getting some pre-drinking started, how many of you are still sitting on Windows XP for some portion of your estate? And how many of you are sad to see it go? Wow, one. You're going to miss it? They like the hill. Turns out you can customize the wallpaper in all of our new operating systems also and put the hills back on. And I've seen people do that. In fact, if we want to get into the hills specifically, I have written the world's greatest Windows 8 app, which will give you the hills as well as a countdown of how much time you've got left, which is, of course, conveniently not showing up on the screen. That's awesome. I'll have to resolve that before the demos start up. In fact, let me switch that real quick. But what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the process and how to go about building an effective compatibility strategy. Here, let me change my resolution and see. That's 1280 by 720. Conveniently, that's not an option. So let's go into advanced settings. That's awesome. All right, where do I go here? Adapter, list all modes. Yeah, see, this is troubleshooting live with Chris Jackson. This is exactly what you bargained to see. How do we change resolutions on Windows 8? Now you know. Are there any questions? Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the conference. Yeah, I agree. That really wasn't that good of a joke. All right, so on to App Compat and talking about how we get our way through this, because today we really have two phenomenons going on when it comes to how do I migrate to the latest operating system. Phenomenon number one is all about velocity. Those folks who are still on XP looking at that countdown going, oh my, there's less than a year now. How am I going to get it done before April 8th of 2014? That has become suddenly very important. And group number two are those who are saying, listen, I'm on Windows 7, right? And I took a break because that transition left me pretty tired. But maybe there are some scenarios where I want to start looking into Windows 8, and I want to be able to get there as effectively as possible while managing my risk. And it's those scenarios that I want to cover, talk about the best practices and the philosophy behind the approaches that I recommend, and give some hints and tips. To start off with, I want to talk about applications themselves and what it means to be compatible and how that impacts how we think about our apps. The way I define a compatible application, that is an application that has no bugs on the platform you want that stop you from getting your work done. Fairly straightforward. The problem with the whole approach is that this guy came along in 1936. This is Mr. Alan Turing, and he proved mathematically that bullet number 1 can never be achieved. So we can't get it done. And so we end up focusing very strongly on bullet number 3, bugs that stop me from getting my work done. And how do I prove that I don't have any of those? I try to get my work done. And if I can, then I don't have any bugs to stop me from doing that. And it really places a very strong emphasis on user testing. Very, very strong. And this is one of the challenges we're constantly seeking to overcome. And as we continue to delve into the process, you'll see some of those emphases. Because user testing requires, as you might have guessed given the name, users. How many of your users leap up and down the moment you ask them to come and test something? Their compliance is generally at issue. So we've got to build a plan that helps to drive compliance. The whole basis behind why we would ever do something like factory model testing, automated testing, is based purely on the fact that by finding enough of the bugs first that it looks like we tried, it looks like I was going to say a phrase that's probably inappropriate to say in public, looks like we cared. And figure out the math behind to do that. We'll talk about that probabilistic approach. But it turns out that's really what matters, is getting to the point where we get users cooperating. The two big bottlenecks we see at customer after customer after customer. Bottleneck number 1, when we have to go out to the business and get the apps themselves. This still surprises me a little bit, that the majority of customers I work with, when they say, this application is business critical, and you say, okay, well, where is it? And they answer, I don't know. And now we've got to go and get it. And now we've got to wait for them, people who aren't on our technology team and aren't intended to work for us. Then we go through and do some pre-testing. We get things packaged up, ready to deliver in an automated way, and everything's good. And then we go back to get their sign-off, and we've got to get them to cooperate again. Those are our two bottlenecks. As we're thinking about applications, another caution I would give you is to not think of your existing application portfolio as you start digging into it and seeing some of the warts going on behind the scene, a little bit of rust behind it, as really old and junky and berating it. And I would say engineers who are working in AppCompat have the greatest tendency to do this. My goodness, how could you still be running something like this? Is this really Visual Basic 3? Wow. And we need to not think of software as something that inherently has an expiration date. Software is not like milk. It doesn't go bad. There is software running that was written in the 1950s that's still driving some very huge organizations, sitting on mainframes. Instead, it's valuable to think of software as being a work of engineering. A work of engineering designed with a particular lifespan. And as long as you remember it's designed for a particular lifespan and try to hold to that lifespan, you end up being more successful. As a way of example, you can build buildings in a number of different ways. These are buildings that were constructed for the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. The World's Fair lasted a year, so consequently, the buildings were designed to last for a year. The buildings were constructed out of plaster of Paris and hemp. I like pointing that out because I seldom get to use the word hemp in a technical presentation. But as a result, after about a year, the buildings weren't very good. But they lasted for that year. And software is the same way. And you can get a fairly good sense of what it was designed for, if it's commercial, by how long the vendor's willing to support it. We support ours for 10 years. That means we put in the engineering effort to make it supportable for 10 years. If you've got a support statement that says 2 years, that means they probably only invested enough engineering effort to make it last for 2 years. With in-house software, the engineering effort to make it supportable is generally on the scope of 1 to 2, maybe 3 years. Nonetheless, the average lifespan of enterprise software is 12 years. So we're using it literally at least 4 times longer than it was designed to be maintainable. That's the pivot to change, to stop thinking that I'm building a perpetual asset, but instead think I'm building an asset designed to be durable for a particular amount of time. While we're talking about these assets and starting to gather knowledge and intelligence of these assets, this is where we start to have conversations on software asset management and managing the whole portfolio as one entity and thinking about how long I plan to keep things around, looking at dependencies, looking at where I'm going to intentionally upgrade them. And some of the dimensions that I'd like to think about if I'm doing an app compat project and looking at everything anyway, as long as I've got that list, what knowledge can I add to the organization? Things like, can I put a quality certification in place? Not a lot of people do this today. But think about if you could say real bare minimum stuff. Don't release new software into our organization if you already know it doesn't work on Windows 7 or Windows 8 or wherever I know we're going. And if you try to put it, we'll have a gate and we won't let you get past. Grandfathering in your existing stuff, but starting to let existing assets gradually age out. So when we think about things like web applications and how we manage that portfolio, right? We'll get into a little bit of the details of this when we get into the technical portion later. There is a geek portion, so if you're a nerd, right, I usually try to do my best not to let you down, but this stuff is important too. Typical web portfolio in the enterprise, right? Behind IE, whether you know it or not, there are, in IE 10, 6 different sets of rules by which we can render a web page. Basically, it's 6 browsers behind one facade. And those browsers date back to 1999, an IE5 emulation. 70% of enterprise web applications still use that IE5 emulation. What's even more fascinating is that 12% of the top 1,000 public websites also use that IE5 Quarks mode emulation. 1 in 10 are building on things that are dating back to the prehistoric ages in terms of web standards. How do we gradually evolve out of that? And it doesn't come from a single effort to say, no, the old stuff has to go, only new stuff can live here. But instead, how do I enforce a gate that says, stop putting in new applications that depend on old technology, so I can gradually retire Quarks mode, so I can gradually retire VB6, so I can gradually retire other old frameworks. When we think about this concept of modernization and leveraging the platform itself, we end up with a lot of people who see those soft costs of it's more productive, it's more maintainable, it's easier to hire people, right? That's an important consideration, I think. 70% of your existing web asset inventory is built on Quarks mode, IE5. How many college kids are out there that you think have ever written code for IE5? They're graduating and coming into your workforce? And let's be honest, how many of them are using IE? Period. Out of college. Are they going to be able to maintain that code? Does that expose you to organizational risk? And people who ignore those soft costs, I love this quote, they prefer being precisely wrong than to being vaguely correct. So I think it's important to think about how we can start transforming the portfolio to move out of managing the infrastructure, managing the established work, sustaining work, and everything is going to pay the mortgage, and instead investing more in systems of innovation. And that comes with investing. I won't dwell on it because we're talking about compatibility and modernization, but it's something to think about as long as you're rifling through the whole list anyway. And as you're rifling through it, also be mindful that over time things become irrelevant. And when they become irrelevant, getting bitter doesn't help, right? I know that sometimes the things we do seem like we're jerks. And sometimes we actually are. And sometimes it just seems like we are, right? But if we invest in something planning on it sticking around forever, we usually get bitten. I'll give some examples. we released some code to help you build SOAP objects back in the days of COM, the SOAP toolkit. And it was one of those on-the-side releases that just kind of spun off of the product group for some reason, and no one really understood why, but it landed on download.microsoft.com, and people embraced it as if it would live forever. And that product team is gone. That was just, hey, how are we going to do SOAP? Let's try this. Oh, yeah, COM, that's not really where we want to go. Let's do it in .NET, and they spun that off, and it was done. You happen to grab it right at the very beginning. Now you got to get out from underneath it. And if you'd never planned that there's any possibility of obsolescence, you end up being sad. And that's not what I want, right? Because we have a lot of really remarkable stories of how things have lasted a long time, either for good or for evil. Here's a good story. Visual Basic 6. Visual Basic 6 was released in 1998. Visual Basic 6, we've already announced, the runtime will be supported on Windows 8, which brings you through an end of extended support of at least 2022. This is how the lifespan of VB6 compares against the lifespans of Buddy Holly, the Betamax, of our good friend Windows XP, and if we go all the way to the bottom, how long do you get a version of, say, Chrome or Firefox for? There can be some really good stories of things lasting a long time. I wouldn't bet on it, right? But that is something to keep in mind. What am I going to invest on? There's also potential danger. One of the conversations I end up having rather a lot. We have chosen to standardize, and this conversation actually happened. We've chosen to standardize on Java 1.5 Update 5. Those of you who are kind of familiar with Java version numbers may be thinking to yourself, wow, 1.5 Update 5, Java 1.5 went out of support about, 2 years ago at Update 22, meaning I'm 17 versions out of date on something 2 years out of date. And turns out that Java is subject to a few active attacks on the internet. Who knew? And the bad guys have figured that out because I have yet to speak to a company who didn't have a standard established lock-in on this version of Java. Not one. And when you lock in on it, guess what happens? The bad guys go, oh, as soon as the patch comes out, everyone who's locked in on that one is vulnerable to something that's known and disclosed. Let's go get it. And there's some very real risk that comes out of that. So when we think about apps, right, I wanted to set that tone. What does it mean to be compatible? What does it mean to manage it? What can I be thinking about to make that asset inventory better? As I'm using, a lot of people are transitioning to the latest version of System Center. There's add-ons that help people manage it. But thinking about how durable you intend it to be, thinking about your platform strategy top to bottom, and expanding your mind, right? Because one aspect of platform and middleware that almost no one's thinking about yet, but it's starting to bite them, jQuery and other web-based UI frameworks that also have expiration dates in order to support the latest browsers. It's middleware, hidden and disguised as a .js file. So that's something I want to think about. So that's my app portfolio. I've got kind of my list of what I'm going to go after, right? With this list, I need to do some math. Turns out people are really bad at math. And as a result, they make a lot of decisions that are somewhat, I'm going to go with crazy. Let's do some math. Let's see if we got a resolution going right here. Oh, look at that. We're awesome. This is my friend, the calculator. And I do a lot of calculations with the calculator, hence the name, to point out where things may not make sense. So we talked about apps, we talked about inventory, and you may have read the messaging that comes out about App Compat, which is it's a super simple 3-step process. Step 1, collect your entire inventory, find anything anyone is using. Step 2, rationalize it. And step 3, test it all. Step 3 might take slightly longer. But let's look at where step 1 can get you into trouble. Step 1 can get you into trouble if I go and find everything and rationalize it, because everything can be a really large number. When I think about Windows applications, a Windows application, the worst software proliferation I've ever seen for installed Windows apps that I've seen personally was an organization in Europe that had 130,000 applications, unique applications installed on their 30,000-seat enterprise. And I have heard of one in the US that got up to 250,000 unique applications installed across the organization. But even those numbers are, while absolutely insane, you can wrap your head around it and get past it. But as soon as you extend your consideration into the rest of your platform, you end up starting to get into trouble. Think about browser apps. Everyone, when they think about, hey, the browser's changing, let's go and do an inventory of browser apps. So if I were to gather a quote-unquote inventory of browser apps, I can't base it on a subset of URL because the navigation scheme can vary in terms of what gets called an app and what doesn't. So I start off always with every unique URL browsed to by someone in the organization. Typical organization browses to on the order of 200 million unique URLs if I collect for long enough across a wide enough base, doing things like querying proxy servers. So 200 million. Now let's rationalize those. I have my list. And doing it manually, I don't know how else to do it, so I'll go ahead and throw some people on it. So let's spend 5 minutes looking at each, so 0.08 hours. And let's get some vendors, right? Let's get them. Should we get them from India or onshore? It's rationalization, right? So language might matter. Maybe we do some onshore guys. We do them for like $100 an hour. All right, so I simply need a budget for $1.6 billion to do your rationalization. Incidentally, if that's within your budget, I would very much like to talk to you. Because I think we can work something out. But I'm guessing that's probably not within your budget, right? And the same is true for Office applications. Oh, if you even looking at them, right? And if I start reversing the math going, wow, well, clearly I'm paying people too much. What variables can I manipulate? I can't change the number of unique URLs I've got. That's constant. So I can pay people less. So I go to minimum wage. Still not cheap enough. So if I compare this to the cost of going out and asking the business to tell me what matters and getting people who would make a lot of money per hour, right? I'll get $300 an hour people, business leaders, and tell them to give me a day and list all the stuff that matters. That has an average organizational cost of about $250,000. Better than $1.6 billion. And in fact, in order to equal that, I need to give those individuals making minimum wage 0.04 seconds per document or per URL to rationalize it. I'm guessing those outcomes probably won't be that good. The math doesn't work out. And we see this happen all the time. The law of large numbers keeps absolutely destroying us when we look across an organization. This is why IT pros get really all the credit in the world for solving the problem of bigness. This is another bigness problem. Think about if I were to go out with ACT and scan every desktop. I had this happen as well. They scanned every desktop with the down-level compatibility evaluators, and they said, all right, we'll bring them all in. We'll run them for 30 days across the entire organization. Didn't do the math. 100,000 seats in the organization. They were scanning for 30 days, and it uploaded 3 times a day, so they ended up with about that many logs. And, whoops. Well, I can't do math either. 100,000, 30 days, 3 apiece, 17 seconds each to process them. So it would take that many seconds to process all of those logs and get their data. That many seconds, which would be that many minutes, which would be that many hours, which would be that many days, which would be that many years. Suddenly, I'm waiting 5 years to get my data. Law of large numbers, right? Everywhere we turn, we're hitting this. So we've got to be really smart. When we think we're going to try and avoid that, then we try to be smart by incurring automation. That's what IT pros do. They bring in automation to solve the problem, and it can often be extremely effective. But when you do automation, we also have to keep in mind that this is a probabilistic exercise. And as such, we need to go back to another mathematician friend of ours, Mr. Bayes, whose theorem tells us how to use probability to get to the predictive aspect. Because when we think of automation, what do you think of? Give me a tool that tells me what's broken. Now, we've already stated that it's an unsolvable problem. So a tool, by definition, cannot be perfect. It's going to be predicting. That doesn't mean there's no value in predicting. We've been trying for hundreds of years to learn how to predict the weather. We're still pretty bad at it, but we're an awful lot better than we were even 50 years ago. It doesn't mean don't try. It means you need to understand the accuracy in order to understand what that means in terms of your predictive ability. For example, we see numbers hitting around the 85% range in terms of accuracy when predicting whether or not an application that worked on Windows XP is going to work on Windows 8. That number's been coming down not because the tools have been getting worse, but because customers have been updating their software. And as they update their software, you've bought a new one, chances are, if it's relatively recent, it probably works. So as fewer things are broken, it becomes harder to find the ones that are. It's just math. So if I hit 85% accuracy, and I have an application that's flagged as broken, or red as the parlance goes, what's the probability that the application is actually broken? If I use the Bayesian theorem, right, and I estimate that on average about 20% of my stuff is going to be broken, right, because that, again, it's been getting better. When we first released Windows Vista, it was a little above 30%, right? It was kind of rough if you were really early in 2006, which is probably why there were not that many people who were really early in 2006. 20% chance it's broken, about 85% accuracy. That means if I have a flag that says it's broken, the probability that it's actually broken is only 59%. Suddenly, you react a lot differently to seeing something flagged. Its predictive power is better than chance. It's better than what you have. But that can start to drive some behavioral changes. For example, in a lot of the work that I do, say, figure out what your cheapest path is. To me, it's all about cost and velocity. If I'm hitting 59% accuracy, I typically have to have someone come along and follow it up. And then I just start running the numbers. How much is it going to cost me for someone per hour to follow it up versus how much would it cost me to just have them look at it anyway? And we use static analysis a lot in the services that we provide to do analysis after we've identified it's broken. Because if we have a human being going, it's broken, the accuracy is close to 100% because they've seen it break. But troubleshooting is hard and expensive and costs me more, so I almost always defer to tools. But if I understand what the tools will actually tell me, I can make those smart decisions. And it turns out it varies by the questions that you're asking. What if I'm going from Windows 7 to Windows 8? Again, a harder problem, so accuracy goes down. And if I have an application that's flagged as broken, when I estimate that not very many will be broken, we're seeing 8%. You know what those 8% are? Version checks. Because everyone fixed all of their Windows XP version checks by replacing with Windows 7 version checks because developers are awesome. But it tells me that I've increased the probability of knowing that it's broken from 8% to 12%. I'm still going to be wrong 9 out of 10 times if I use it to be predictive for a given app, which is a different question than how predictive it is for the portfolio. For the portfolio, it tends to average 60% better to make a forecast for cost for my budget, but terrible for making a list of what I have to do. Keeping these math facts in mind helped me figure it out. IE6 to IE10. This is a just absolutely incredibly hard problem. that everyone's struggling with because everyone wants to automate that, but we're still doing about 30% in terms of accuracy, which means there's about a 13% chance you're actually broken coming off of IE6. But when you do the numbers going from IE8 to IE10, where what we anticipate is a very small number of applications to fail, and we'll talk about what those are when we get geeky later on, although a bunch of math is not exactly ungeeky, I don't think. Turns out that if you do nothing and just assume there's a 5% chance it's broken, and compare that with running a tool and investigating only those things as flagged, after you've run the tool, the ones that the tool says are broken statistically only have a 2% chance of being broken. You're actually worse off with the data than you were before. Not because people don't know how to write programs, but because the problem is so darned hard. So I need to use the tools within the construct of what they're able to do mathematically. Doesn't mean they don't help you. I use tools all the time, but I want to make sure I'm using them in a sensible way so I can filter out the signal from the noise and focus on what matters, because that's the important part. Right? I had a conversation just this morning. I won't disclose who it was, but the customer I was talking to was like, listen, we have less than a year. We don't have time to stop and look around. Here's the question I was asking. They're not only doing a migration, they're doing an AD consolidation at the same time. A lot of people bunch these together, right? And in this conversation, they said, we don't have time to stop and look around. And the question I asked was, well, do you know which are your really critical applications that have a dependency on authorization based on network credentials? And they said, we don't have time to do this analysis paralysis. We're not going to stop and look around. I need to focus my attention, because here's the thing. Statistically speaking, if I'm doing a domain migration, the app failure rate is roughly 2%. But those 2% are almost universally the biggest, most complex, and most important apps you've got. Which means I want to get the signal really early and start working on them today, not in January when I find them, by treating everything equally. All threats are not created equal. Think back to how we reacted to noise in communications in 1941 when Pearl Harbor was attacked. There was a lot of noise, that there was danger. And the noise that they focused in on was, there is danger from terrorists here on the islands of Hawaii. It's easier for us to guard the gateway to a single place, so let's put all of the boats together in this harbor, squeezed as tightly as they can. That makes it easier to protect against that particular potential problem. They focused on the noise, and they ignored the signal, thereby making it extremely easy for someone who's trying to destroy all of your boats from airplanes to just go, oh, hey, look at that. They're all right here. They forecast the wrong thing. And that's what we're constantly trying to avoid, to improve our ability to forecast and understand the limitations of our forecasting models. In other words, we're digging a hole. And the law of holes states that when you realize you're standing in a hole, it's time to stop digging. We are programmed to think that there's always a right answer to something. We don't think probabilistically, right? Statistics, how many of you love statistics? How many of you have even known all the statistics I've had on the screen so far in this presentation? Right? Our brains don't think that way intuitively, and our educational system doesn't really encourage it. We encourage absolute correctness, and we can never get that. There's too much complexity. So as a result, we need to react to that complexity by figuring out how to structure a process that takes that into account. The process I recommend kind of goes into a pattern like this, right? Steps 1 and 2 are required. Steps 3 and 4 are advised, right? When I think about applications and how I categorize them, in order to focus on the signal and focus on what's important, I like to put in a 4-part taxonomy that defines how I treat my application, that drives behavior directly. Category number 1, managed applications. Those are the applications where I'm going to put a commitment. When I change something in its stack, I'm going to make sure that I manage the risk of something happening to that app proactively. I'm going to look at it for you. And when I start thinking about managing my IT, that's the kind of thing I start budgeting for or charging back for. In essence, I'm providing you an insurance policy. And much like if I go to Allstate and say, hey, Allstate, you know what? I bought this house, right? I had you for my car insurance. I didn't tell you I bought the house, right? I just went to the local Best Buy, bought myself a house, right? It burned down. So give me some money. Allstate's not going to do anything. But that happens all the time in apps. They go out, they go to Best Buy, they buy an app, they bring it back to their office. They're local admins on XP, of course, so they drop the CD in, they install it. You have to go and find it, learn that they have it, charge a premium if you're going to, and then pay up if something fails. You're giving them free insurance for anything that they can manage to somehow trick someone into installing. That doesn't work. Having a defined managed application, if you want an SLA, here's what's going to be in there. We're going to have quality criteria. We're going to have processes to get you in there. Category 2, supported applications. Those that I will not look at beforehand, but if they break, you can call us and we'll get it fixed. In the world of office migrations, this represents nearly everything out there. Not everything, but nearly everything. Average of 25 million documents in a typical organization. I'm not going to look at all of them. I'll look at a few, right? The ones that are running on the trading room floor of a major financial institution. Oh, I'm looking at that one. But I'm not going to go scouring file shares looking for .doc files and inspecting them all because I can't afford it. But if I can have a remediation in place that fixes it in half an hour, most people are fine with that. And you just say, if you're not fine with that, get it on the managed list. We'll take any kind of app you got, but here are the requirements to get there. Category 3 is the unsupported. You can run it. If you get it installed, we're not going to actively seek it and try and tear it down. But if you call us for help, you're on your own. So if that document happens to be your resume, turns out we're not going to invest in getting that working for you. And then finally, banned. That's where things like AppLocker come in. This starts to drive behavior. Structured testing tests managed applications and only managed applications. We have a process. We run it through. We look at all of them. We get sign-off, and we're done. Organic testing is we're going to have pilots, and you'll try it. And if you've got a problem, you'll call us, and we'll help you out. Different level of commitment because we're focusing on the signal and what's important and what's driving business value. It is as a result of these statistics and these approaches that we have dramatically changed our product portfolio around AppCompat. We look at what we're doing for Windows. On Windows, right, I gave you some stats for some of the tools looking at various transitions, like from XP to Windows 7 or Windows 8. ACT's down-level compatibility evaluators. Didn't give you those statistics. They turn out to be about as good as chance, right? So you got two options. You could invest some time and money to set up ACT and deploy it everywhere and collect some data and wait for it and blah, blah, blah. Or you can get a college kid to flip a coin because the results will be roughly about as good. Rather get the college kid, personally. So we got rid of them. What we focused on was the wrong thing. We were at issue fidelity. If we said you have this issue, you almost certainly did. We were really right on the issues. But we looked for about 12 issues, which were very poorly predictive. It was a bad model for forecasting whether the app as a whole would work or not. And that's what users expected. So we didn't meet expectations, so we got rid of it. Same is true on the Office side. OMPM, OEAT, OCCI, they're all gone, replaced with telemetry, which is focused on how do we gather a list of the apps that people are actually opening all the time so they end up on MRU. A dramatic change in the direction and assumptions around the tools built in there. Oh, incidentally, if you've gone looking for ACT lately, it's hidden inside of the assessment and deployment kit. Had a lot of people struggling to find that lately, so figured I would mention that. And before we get into the geekier things, I also want to kind of talk about the people that are involved in this, right? Motivating a team, because this turns out to be one of the most remarkably strong differentiators between successful and non-successful organizations. And it really starts with setting a tone of expecting success, the Pygmalion principle. And if you want to try this on your own, I had to search for quite a long time on image searches to find an image representing Pygmalion that I could put on a screen here. Turns out in that era, they typically were not well enough dressed for me to display them. But the principle is this: creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like My Fair Lady. You put someone, they look like, they act like, they behave like someone who's proper, and they actually become that way. And it's the same way with a team. If we believe we're successful, we end up being more successful. If we set that up, motivation in the team is key. That leads to processes that help to drive motivation. For example, some of the approaches I've seen really keep motivation high in the sense of believing in yourself from a team perspective include topping the list, deploying by role, or opt-in deployments, also extremely successful. Here's what I mean. If you say, we're going to get all the apps, right, and hopefully you've just got the signal, and we're going to test them. We're just going to wait till they're all done. It's going to be all very sequential. We're going to be very structured and orderly about it. And then when we're done, big bang, we're going to have a heck of a party blowing all the desktops out. But morale kind of stagnates because no one's really believing they can do it because they've never seen themselves do it. If I deploy by role, right, I'll tell the story of a now defunct airline because it got merged in, but Continental was a case study. And I loved how they did app compat because they went after a role first. We're going to do gate agents. Why'd they choose gate agents? Number one, they've got 10 pieces of software. So they can get through that app compat project really fast. Number two, they've got a phone right there and can call the call center to do absolutely everything because they turn out to be disconnected rather a lot from their computers anyway. So there's no training involved in getting them back on base if something goes wrong. So the risk drops down. And boom, they blew it all out to all those gate agents. And suddenly the team is reporting success. Look, we can do it. Now they're hungry for more. Terrific motivator, right? In fact, it was so successful, my favorite part of the story, they deployed Newark Airport by accident and didn't realize it till the end of the day. Then they're like, oh, wow, we deployed that, which is probably my favorite deployment story. My second favorite is the technology company, it's a computer manufacturer, that they were building their golden image for their internal Windows 7 deployment. They threw it on a file share, forgot to secure the file share. Someone else found it, told their friends, and when they did a measurement a couple of months later, having no idea that anyone had found this because they weren't tracing it, they were 1/3 deployed on the unsecured file share method. Opt-ins have the exact same effect, which is if people can go up, right, and this is one of the services that we do, and I've seen a lot of variations of this from other services vendors, we'll build a portal that will show you, here's the software on your machine, here's what reports is working so far, so they can compare it and choose for themselves. If all the stuff that really matters to them is green, signed off on, they can schedule their own deployment. Two benefits. Number one, you start having your numbers trickle upwards without even having to do any work. Number two, users who choose to go are much more accepting of failure than ones that you're imposing on. The exact same change happened. They went from XP to Windows 7. They went from XP to Windows 8. There's nothing different about the change other than they picked it and not big bad IT. So suddenly they're like, oh, something went wrong, but you know what? At least they got the new cool stuff. The new cool stuff, incidentally, is starting to matter. One of the funniest help desk requests I've read lately from a customer I'm working with right now where someone actually submitted, college hire, listen, if you're going to force us to use 10-year-old technology that was created when I was 11, you're going to have to provide me with training on how to use it. So now they're opting in. The morale aspect is different. When we think about this morale and building that up, app compat to me is not about choosing a tool and automation and grinding your way through it. And in fact, because of the statistics I mentioned earlier, right, the most common usage of tool data from things like ACT or OMPM and in some cases other aspects of tools are that we run through, we check the box saying, I did something app compat-y without measuring its quality. And then we take that database, we stick it in a corner, and we never look at it again between now and the end of time. This is exactly what we want to avoid. Always be asking, right, or on the tool space, what's the accuracy? What's the value, and how do I react to that? There is a difference. If you have a services vendor who's helping you with it, you want to say, what's your accuracy rate going to be? They won't be able to get it perfect, but you need to be able to start banking on that, and that matters. And then you need to have a process that continues to reinforce people's belief in that. This is actual psychological data that says if you give people goals and you give them feedback, you increase their performance by more than double the expected increase from doing nothing or either of the two independently. Incidentally, I was a psychology major. I don't have a degree in computer science, so I'm kind of interested in this stuff. I think it matters because when it comes right down to it, the only way you're ever going to get there is by crowdsourcing. It'll be like Tom Sawyer, like, hey, why don't you test this app for me? Got to make it seem like fun to them. Right? I've seen people even go as far with really resistant customer units. Hey, we got these new laptops. I can get you one early if you wouldn't mind trying out some stuff. Right? Now, you have it anyway, right? They're going to get it. But can we manipulate that and help them go faster and begin to crowdsource? Right? Have pilot testing, incorporate that in. Have opt-in deployments. Because what ends up happening is there's too much knowledge out there. This is a chart from some research done by a professor at MIT. His name is Cesar Hidalgo. Talks about the network effects and how knowledge gets embedded across a network. And the more you have to distribute that knowledge, the more sophisticated the organization or the society is. Yet we have these approaches that all talk about concentrating knowledge when it can't be done. So we need to understand we're going to have knowledge thrown all over the place. We need to figure out how to leverage it and maximize it and get cooperation and having people be motivated. Last non-geeky thing, and then we're getting geeky, right? This is an app compat guy session, so we're going to see some geeky action going on because I want to tell you about some of the specific technical details of what to expect. But this is one that's been creeping up kind of a lot lately, which is the configuration and how that potentially impacts how hard the transition is going to be. Here's what I mean. So I ran a team for a number of years, which was called the App Compat SWAT team. Right? And our job was to be the final escalation point for enterprise customers, which is if you've got a problem and no one else can help you, much like the A team, you call us and we would show up and we would help get it fixed. We worked at Windows, we worked on IE, we worked on Office. In the world of IE, we track data, right? Because we thrive on data, because that drives how we invest in the product, right? I viewed part of our job to provide feedback on, wow, this really sucked for the enterprise. Because when it comes to apps, we don't really know, because that data is all locked behind your firewall. So until we started getting on airplanes and flying out there, we could break in your stuff right and left, and we wouldn't even know it. We didn't see the impact. Right? We started to see, in the world of IE, we got up to a point where about 10% of the bugs that we were asked to investigate in the world of IE would occur only when that organization's group policies were applied. And on vanilla IE of that particular version, there was no problem whatsoever. Configuration matters. And when it comes to configuration, right, particularly around security, we need to keep in mind the law of non-contradiction. You cannot both be something and not be something. People constantly want this. They want things to both be true and false simultaneously and don't see why that's a problem. For example, I want to have everyone be a local administrator, but I don't want them to be able to change this setting. By definition, if they're a local administrator, there is nothing you can do to stop them from doing that. Oh, I've got group policy. I can control that. Do you know how easy it is to subvert group policy? Group policy, that agent runs his local system. The registry key you're trying to thwip, ACL to allow local system to write there. You're an admin, re-ACL it and remove local system's ability to write there, and boom, no more policy. Contradiction. You can't have it. I want to have standard users, and simultaneously I want them to be able to install any ActiveX control that comes their way. Contradiction. Right? And these are the things to keep in mind. And when it comes to complexity, there's a great article, and I'm going to navigate to it just because I think it's super, super important to internalize this. It is sticking with proven, known configurations. Dan.com. That should be good enough. Let's try proven. Wow, my web search mojo is not rolling for me today. All right. USGCB blog. No, that's not it. So it's a blog that Aaron Margosis wrote a little while ago now, sticking with well-known and proven solutions. That's what it's called. And it talks about the dangers of going in and hyper-customizing. And I can't tell you the number of sessions I've sat in where we take an Excel spreadsheet with a list of all of the group policies for that version of Windows, that version of Office, that version of IE, and we go one by one through each and every one of them and try to choose the best possible answer, giving you your own hyper-customized configuration. You've got your own software sitting on top of that, and he points around, hey, if you see any of these hints, you may potentially have a problem. So if you have a guy who manages your app deployments, if he gets hit by a truck, you're probably going to go out of business. You may be at risk for this, because these things end up causing very real risk. When you think about what the size of that risk is, let's look at the law of large numbers again. IE alone has over 1,500 group policies, and consequently, this is the number of different possible permutations of the policies in IE that you can potentially configure. By way of comparison, this is the number of molecules in the observable universe. It turns out we don't have that many test cases. And therefore, you're testing something that no one else in the observable universe has ever seen before. And that turns out to be more risky than whatever knobs you wanted to twitch a great deal of the time. In the past, we had a lot of not so secure by default, more functional by default as our option. Secure by default is our mantra. There are some things you should change, but the changes you make should be scenario-based, not the, oh, it looks good. Particularly because, and if you were at my session yesterday, the metaphor I used was, I believe that the people who write the text for group policies do so by just taking their face and beating it against a keyboard, and whatever English words come out, that's what they use. They don't always mean exactly what they say. And there end up being all kinds of potential unintended consequences, right? So the metaphor I used here is the domestication of grain. Domestication of grain was kind of a good thing if you were a hunter and gatherer society. You didn't have to go out and find some berries and then grab your bow and arrow and go find some deer. You could just grow some wheat. That's a positive. But there are some unintended consequences of that. When we look at that kind of society, nutrition starts to go down. It turns out that a nice deer is better for you than bread. No offense to any vegetarians or vegans, right? So berries also better for you than bread, right? It turns out that the impact for women, that's where we really saw the advent of extreme inequality, because they would have to stay at home and grind the wheat. And you see all the skeletal remains, and they had a pretty miserable life grinding wheat. Gender inequality exploded. And that became a challenge. Unintended consequences. It happens in technology. Someone went through, and as part of an original draft of the United States Government Configuration Baseline, by the way, that is a set of group policies agreed upon by the entirety of the U.S. federal government. This is their standard. Everyone will have the same thing. They decided they wanted to be more secure than the default because they're the government, right? DOD included as well, right? So the people who are running our armed forces, kind of good that they're thinking about security, but they also see the extreme value of consistency to have predictable results. One of the things they did early on is they read something and they said, this seems like I don't need it. The ability to use a privilege to get into any other process on the box. They said, okay, that's kind of a strange privilege, right? Lets me open up any process and get into it, even if I don't have permission to it. Enable the privilege and go do it. Let's give that to nobody. So they gave it to nobody, and now no one can open up processes that are not owned by them. Right? Seems kind of like a secure choice, doesn't it? You can always rationalize your way into it without data. Here's the problem with that. It turns out that there is not a single piece of database software in the world that will install without this privilege. Not one. So the unintended consequence is the government now has to run without databases. So we changed that, right? But that's a potential danger. So we need to think about all of these things when building our strategy. Think about people. Think about the fallibility of people and tools, as well as the strengths to come up with a process that manages those large numbers. Sometimes it takes humans. We hate humans because we're IT pros. We like automation. But sometimes the human brain can think through problems faster than I can encode them and troubleshoot them. So I want to take the time we have left and get a little bit nerdy and get into some of the details of what to expect, particularly around Windows 8. Now, here's what I'm seeing in terms of what customers are considering for Windows 8, right? How many of you are considering Windows 8 at all for even a single PC in your organization? How many of you are considering it for all of them? So a couple, right? I'm actually going to go work with a customer. Right? This is one of those, you got to feel really bad for me. Yeah, we need some help for our customer, the Bank of New Zealand. Can you come help us? Oh, in New Zealand? Can you twist my arm? Okay, I'll go. Right, so they're, I guess I shouldn't have dropped names, but I'm going to New Zealand. For a name not to be repeated again. But they're friends of mine. Anyway. Kind of commensurate with what I'm seeing. I see some people are saying, you know what, I think this is a fit for all the stuff that we're doing. But I still see a lot of people going, you know what? I'm really freaking tired from having gone to Windows 7. I don't want another big project for a while. Can I have a break, right? Anyone feel like that? Like, you know what? Kind of a little bit of fatigue, right? Wounds are still a little bit raw. Let's let them heal a little bit. But what I am seeing is I've got this scenario that would be perfectly met with touch. Windows 8 Touch is so much better. That's the big one that I'm seeing. You know, I've got one customer that's got this scenario put together that's literally give people a device with 10 apps, and that's all they'll ever use. And that implements that scenario perfectly. They're going to run those on Windows 8. They're going to run the rest on Windows 7. And tools today allow you to run a heterogeneous environment. The whole bring your own PC and flexible work style initiatives have the very positive benefit of making it possible to manage heterogeneous environments today where that was harder before. So that's what I'm seeing. So then the next question they ask is, well, what's probably going to break? In the world of desktop Windows apps, all of the things that ask for a particular version are going to potentially fail. And so you'll learn to master all of the version lies. Right? So to put in version lies, how many of you are familiar with shims? And that's a term that you know pretty well. How many of you are not? So a couple of people. All right, I'll give a quick example of shims and explain it. I'll even do it in assembler because that's how I roll. Everyone's like, this guy's a little crazy. He just went from a sort of a psychological thing to jumping some assembler on the ground. I don't really know what's going on there. Let's do, I'm going to go into Windows, App Patch, and let's pull in AC Layers. That'll be fun. And all right, so I'm going to get this started. Otherwise, we'll be waiting for this to disassemble for a while, and that'll be really boring. But the solution for that's relatively easy, right? So I had a conversation during my session yesterday where everyone's like, I got an app that won't install on this. How do I fix it, right? If it's a version lie and it's an MSI, it's really easy. Statistically speaking, what we're seeing is that about 60% of the application failures happen at install time. I cannot get bits on the box. The remaining 40% happen at runtime, right? This is another major initiative that I'm looking to try and fix because I think that's really remarkable. You have something whose job it is to install software. That's its only job, and it fails to do that a remarkable percentage of the time. A lot of it's checking for versions, isn't durable across versions. Even when it's not doing that, I've seen some really remarkable things. I had one organization I worked with where they had an application installation failure rate of 20%. And they had a new packaging strategy and got it down to 5%, and huge victory. So literally, their victory was 1 out of 20 times I go to install software with a tool designed to do nothing but install software, software doesn't install. Hooray, that's improvement. And globally, the numbers are somewhere around 8%. 8% of the time you try to push something out through System Center, it doesn't successfully install. I had one customer who will go unnamed, and there's no one from that customer in the room, so you can't look for red faces. They had an application that ran on some of their structured task workers' desktops that had a failure rate of 50%. On average, they had to run the installer 8 times to get the software installed. This is where we're coming from. So number one, make better software packages. We're seeing a transition in the packaging industry to focus on quality and not just, is it an MSI? I'll judge it by the fact that it has an MSI extension. Therefore, they're all the same. They're not all the same. And quality matters. So we see that difference there. If I have an MSI that's checking for the version, I can crack it open, go to the launch condition, and delete it. Problem solved. Or transform it to delete it. If it's a running application, what I can do is I can just apply a version lie like the Windows 7 RTM version lie and just pretend to be Windows 7 if that's what it wants. That's very simple. That's very straightforward. And honestly, that's most of what we're seeing on desktop Windows apps. It's not everything, right? We do, if you've got antivirus software, things like that are really going deep underneath the covers, those potentially have some problems. But beyond that, you can have one-offs. If you're not a one-off, you're probably in pretty good shape. Compatibility is really high. And you kind of would expect that, because where was our investment? Our investment wasn't in desktop apps. We weren't changing the model there. It was making a whole brand new model for apps, totally separate from desktop apps. And desktop apps mostly just carry over. Now you just got a plan of, all right, well, if I want to use new stuff, I'll just build some new stuff. My old stuff is mostly going to get grandfathered unless it's checking for the version or sort of groveling around in the kernel and expecting nothing to ever change. If I have a problem with my desktop apps, what that means is I'm coming from XP, all the knowledge, right, and we can dig back into some of the previous technical sessions about Windows 7, all of that still applies. The fixes to apply will be either get a new one, go in and change the code, but you also have shims as an option. So real quick for the few folks, I know it's only about 20% of the people in the room, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but I'm going to mention what it is. A shim is, in essence, a way to leverage, let's look at it this way, the design of Windows to change the behavior targeting a specific app. Here's what I mean. What I've done to make this, wow, that is so small now that I look over at it. Let's do this. The way that Windows works from the perspective of an application, it's a pile of DLLs. That's it. Windows is DLLs as far as an app matters. How you call into Windows is we have a table because DLLs can move around within a virtual memory space. We have an idea of where they'd like to load, but if someone else is already there, we have to put it somewhere else because the space is already taken, which means we have a layer of abstraction that says, hey, if I want to use this particular function in Windows, right, this is from, or from apphelp.dll, which is a Windows DLL, if I want to use that, here's a table. When we load this into memory, we have to resolve that table. So we say, oh, where's that DLL? Oh, it's at this point in memory. We then add the offset, and that goes in the table. Boom, now we just call and say, hey, whatever is at this table entry's memory address, go run that code. Since we have a table, you know what shims do? They just write something else in that table. I want to call the get version API. All right, well, it would have called in to actually give you the real version of Windows. We just call into a shim DLL, and it says, yeah, actually, I'm really Windows XP. By writing one entry in a table, right? That kind of makes sense? It's API interception, right? And there are a couple of different ways to do it. We can go into the academia. I don't want to get too much into the details of that. But it makes it so I can target a fix specifically at an application rather than across the board to do things like change behavior. So coming from Windows XP, I may have applications that expect to be an admin. And since they expect to be an admin, one of their favorite things to do is to go ahead and ask if they're an admin. So we can address that. Is user not found? Really? Well, that's awesome. Maybe that's in, hold on, let me pull in AC General. Sections, text, decompose that. That'll be fun. I'll tell you what this does, though, right? So one of the things they commonly do is they say, hey, is the user an administrator? So what do? We intercept calls into APIs like is user an admin, and we replace it, right? And what I'll show you, if this assembles fast enough, although it looks like it's not doing it, is the answer we put in is really very simple. The code for is user an admin is one line. Return true. That's how we fix it. Is user an admin? Yes. Yes, they are. Problem solved. Of course, then you've got to fix all the other things that caused them to write that code in the first place. All right, and I'll leave as an exercise to the reader to disassemble it. It's actually the easiest to read assembly language in the world. I thought that would be a fun little bit of icing on the cake, but apologies for that, picking the wrong DLL. But that's how shims work. So I have that as an option to repair my applications. Coming from Windows 7 to Windows 8, the expectation you want to have is that if I have a problem in a desktop app, it's probably not going to be an easy one. If I'm coming from XP to Windows 8, my expectation should be it'll probably be one of the same issues that are already well known and documented from Windows 7, mostly around the introduction of UAC and the assumption that everyone is not an administrator. Oh, here it is. Just because I can't resist having some assembly language on the screen. I mean, I am the AppCompat guy. Right, here's the code for it. Right, we do some logging up in the logging here, blah, blah, blah. Then we zero out the accumulator register. This is what we return from, right? This is sort of assembly language, not even 100, but 1. Make the return value 0. Doing an exclusive OR happens to be the fastest way to do that on an x86 processor. We then increment it to make it 1. We then return its return true. The performance characteristics of that are remarkably fast compared to actually looking in your token. But that's all we do with shims. So, desktop apps, probably a good story. If you're broken, hope you have someone smart nearby, right? That is the next important topic from a staffing perspective. You need to figure out what knowledge is valuable to have in-house and what knowledge you want to rent. When I looked at building my team, the AppCompat SWAT team, it took an average of 6 to 12 months, depending on the individual, to get to the point where I could dispatch them to any customer in the world to resolve their hardest problems. It takes a lot of training. On average, a typical customer needs that level of expertise for an average of about 2 weeks. So a 1-year investment for 2 weeks of payout doesn't tend to make a whole lot of sense. So that's where you want to ferret out. Think about the different skill sets and what you'd like to enhance and bring in-house, and make sure that if you ask for help, you get the right help. I want to increase my organization's ability to do troubleshooting. Good. then let's make sure that when you're going through and doing troubleshooting, here's a great opportunity to get some practice. So let's make sure those people are in the loop and getting that practice and getting that partnership from whoever's helping me out, if anyone's there. But let's not learn hardcore debugging unless I have some reason to know hardcore debugging in my organization. Those are skills we should rent. Does that make sense? That's the balance to take, is think about what knowledge you want to own and what knowledge you want to take home. Let's go into the final piece here. What should you really be concerned about? And what you should be concerned about is IE. And there are a couple of reasons you should be concerned about IE. Not because it's really hard, but because you've got to think about it. And if you take some steps, you'll suddenly make it an awful lot easier. Thing number one. I mentioned earlier, IE is kind of like a multi-headed beast, right? You never really know which IE it is at any given moment in time because we've got a lot of complexity hidden behind that. There are, in essence, 6 different IEs behind the one facade of IE. I mentioned that the default 70% of enterprise applications are running in Quarks mode. Remember that? Well, here's the fun part. On IE 10, there are 2 of them. 1, 2. And the one that you get depends upon whether you're in compatibility view or not. Why on earth did we do that? We did that because on the public internet, there's lots of Quarks mode out there. Turns out our Quarks mode, IE5 emulation, is very, very different from the Quarks mode of every other browser manufacturer out there, from Firefox, from Safari, from Chrome, from Opera, from all the other guys. They're different. And different is bad. You should be able to have the same markup. So we made a new Quarks mode that behaves an awful lot like everybody else's Quarks mode because that's what users want. They want to use whatever browser they want to and have them behave the same. And you know, we have people saying, oh, everyone's designing all this stuff for IE. Well, now we're seeing designed only for WebKit. Right? And people are being really crazy about that. Same markup should work. Pick whatever browser you want, and we'll lay it out the same way. But we have to leave the existing one because enterprise applications are probably actually designed for this one, and they have a single browser strategy for the most part, so they don't need this varying behavior. They really want it to be the way it always was. They don't want to have to change it. They want to grandfather in. If you're in compatibility view, which is the default for the local intranet zone, you're cool. But if you're putting in fully qualified domain names, we may not detect you in the local intranet zone. And as a result, we don't throw you in compatibility view. And as a result, you start rendering differently. I'm starting to see this a lot with SharePoint 2007 web applications in extranet scenarios because SharePoint 2007 uses Quarks mode and doesn't behave correctly in interoperable Quarks. It behaves correctly in IE5 Quarks. So I'm always adding those sites to the local intranet zone to get the SharePoint sites to work. So 2 Quarks modes and zoning correctly to get into compatibility view so you get the one you want. Challenge number 1. And this website I have going on right now is actually an example of why we did that. This is a web page, and you can see that this kind of slid behind here is one that was designed and tested in other browsers, right? It's an educational organization, so of course they were using Firefox. That's how they roll. Oh, yeah, all the edu guys are here laughing, right? That's still from this side, I guess. That fixes it. That's why we did that, to make more things work correctly in those scenarios. So that could potentially impact you. The other is a flat-out version check. So let's go ahead and, hit the start button for too long. So let's go to another application. Actually, this is on localhost, right? The Contoso Ninja application. Oh, come on. Let's get the dev tools open so I can go in and see the code. And I'm going to navigate to, what's that guy? Oh, not that guy. 1.4. Counts. And go, oh, wow, that's a very typical error message. Why do you suck so bad? Fascinating. I wonder what's going on there. So I go and take a look and see what's going on here. Oh, here's this function. If I go into the script tab, I can see it a little bit easier. All right, so here we go. Here's the regular expression, right? So we're looking for MSIE and then some character, and we're only going to look for one character because IE will never have two numbers, right? We're parsing a string. What's one property of IE10 that IE9 didn't have? 10 has two characters. And we're only looking at the first one. And the reality is, there are, in this world, precisely 5 people who know how to write regular expressions. They post their stuff on the web, and the rest of the planet copies and pastes from there. And we end up with things like this. And this problem actually turns out to, and here's the error message you get. Remember this? The problem gets exacerbated a little bit. I've learned precisely how to go in and detect that. In the dev tools, if you see a failure in do postback, turns out the guys who wrote ASP.NET also didn't expect us to ever have a 2-digit version number and had exactly the same problem. We've patched that, so you want to make sure you patch your ASP.NET to clear up that problem. Those are your 2 really big problems: version checks, version checks, version checks, and 2 quirks modes. And beyond that, it turns out so far, I mean, yeah, you're still hitting some decent, single-digit percentages, way better than XP to Win 7. It's not zero work, but it's manageable work and a lot easier remediation. And for the potential really small number of hard stuff, chances are it's going to be pretty hard, right? So you'll probably want to enlist someone who can get your back and cover for that. Last but not least, you also have some people who do stuff like this. Uh-oh, looks like your browser needs some fixing. Right, let's see how broken our browser is. Let's go into Tools, Change User Agent String. Let's call ourselves Chrome if Chrome is so awesome. And refresh that page. And let's just see how much my browser needs a fixin'. And it turns out that, A, it's not the most performant application in the world, but my browser doesn't need a fixin'. What needs a fixin' is the fact that they are jerks. So with that, I know we're out of time, but I've got a short video featuring child labor, so how can you resist that, to close out our session? And we need volume.
Years ago, in 2005, computers used to look like this. Back when I was 1 year old. Look at this thing. It weighs way more than me. With Windows 8, my surface looks this small. And it is so much more powerful. And it also features mandatory integrity control. That's what the UAC for all your non-hackers out there. And keep me safe when people try to hack me. I had my credit card number stolen 5 times. I wouldn't have a credit card. Now I'm protected by application isolation. It keeps me safe when I run my Windows 8 apps. But there's lots of bad hackers. Someone's trying to hack me. I'm a genius hacker. I'm a hacky player. Own it. But now I'm talking. Windows 8. It is made of pure awesome sauce. Awesome sauce. I want you to have my good player.
And with that, have a terrific party and a great rest of MMS.